of advice do you have to homeowners?
Practicing that preparedness. Starting the conversation now is always going to be a benefit to any association out there.
And welcome to Recovery Report Live. I'm Dan Odess, president of GlobalPro, where we manage risk to recovery, and we have managed more than $1 billion in recovery for business owners and community associations alike. And if we can do anything to help you as insurance coverage experts, let us know. That's what our team is here 24/7, 365 days a year. And this show, the Recovery Report Live, was started with the idea of giving you information you can use. So I want to get right into our show today. It's just me. No one is coming on with me for an interview, but I want to talk about an important outcome of a recent case that was filed in Louisiana. Now, it wasn't a recent case as in making the case, because quite frankly, it was the first of its kind. It was the first lawsuit filed in Louisiana related to pandemic-related loss or damages. Now, what's important about this case is that there's two parts, right? Number one, as the courts found, the policy does not have an exclusion in the policy for virus, okay? That's what's important here. And the tides are turning because that's something that we've talked extensively about here on the show. That's something that we've brought on experts, whether they're brokers and attorneys and engineers and other experts in fields that related to insurance to talk about loss or damage, whether pandemic related or otherwise. And what I'm getting at is that all of these experts, they look for root cause and coverage, right? That's collectively the outcome that you're looking for is what is the cause and is there coverage? Now, the engineers are going to focus obviously on causation, where the attorneys are going to focus on coverage, right? They're going to see whether or not you've complied with your policy obligations, whether or not the insurance company has done what it's supposed to do. The adjusters on the GlobalPro team are going to investigate and assist the engineers and contractors, and you investigate your damages, prove your damages, and the experts at GlobalPro will evaluate your policy and look for coverages. Now, and the reason why I say this is to explain the process by which we would go through in determining whether or not you have coverage under your policy. We would look for specific exclusions in your policy that may limit or exclude your recovery. Now, and I say limit if it's an exclusion because there may be portions of your loss and damage that may be covered under other sections of your policy, but there may be an exclusion that's specific to some portion of it, right? So, and that's the process by which we go through. So when we saw these policies early on in the process, as we've issued memos, we've done other broadcasts, again, I brought on experts to talk about these things. One of the things that we focused in on was this idea that many policies did not include a specific exclusion for virus or pandemic or microbiology or many of the other pollution or many other things that insurance companies were trying or have tried successfully to date, up until this case, to exclude coverage for policyholders. Even though there are literally dozens of different kinds of forms that would specifically and most often exclude the type of claim that was made by many business owners. And I say many business owners. I mean, we have dozens of these cases in our office, and I know of many others out there that do not have an endorsement that specifically excludes pandemic. Their pollution exclusions don't include anything regarding viruses or anything like that, as it makes it absolutely completely silent on the issue, right? It doesn't exclude pandemic. There's actually there's policy forms that actually include coverage for pandemics and epidemics and various other types of situations similar to this, right? So that's important, right? So that's important, goes in the analysis as to whether or not we're even going to pursue a claim on behalf of a policyholder. It's important in analysis whether or not an insured can actually make a claim and understand. And most of these brokers and agents were totally taken aback by the response by insurance companies where there is no exclusion for much of anything related to, or that could be construed to relate to the claims being made for loss and damage related to the pandemic, the government shutdowns, etc., all the other things that were being claimed for, right? So this is a recent decision by the Louisiana Appellate Court, found coverage under a commercial policy form, it's important here, for loss and damage caused by the pandemic. Now, I have some notes here and I want to kind of go through it. The case was filed by Cage and Conti, okay? It's under the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed a trial court decision that dismissed a lawsuit, right? So the lower court dismissed the lawsuit and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed this decision. The policy issue did not, and I repeat, did not contain a virus exclusion, which is really important. The court's opinion held, okay, and this is what it states. Upon review, we conclude that the insurance policy is ambiguous and capable of more than one reasonable interpretation in regards to coverage of lost business income. The contract should be interpreted in favor of the appellants. This relied upon a precedent which found coverage when insured's property is rendered unusable and uninhabitable. All right. So, and to summarize, right, there's really 3 points here. The policy did not contain an exclusion for viruses. I've certainly stated that several times now. Number 2, there's a precedent in Louisiana that physical damage was not necessary to trigger coverage. Now that's important, right? So it's important that you don't just assume that you're sitting in other states throughout the United States that because this happened in Louisiana, this is going to happen for you as a business owner that may have suffered these types of losses and made a claim, and perhaps you're even in a lawsuit that may have been dismissed or that's pending and waiting a decision. It's important to understand that each state obviously has its own body of law, interprets things in various different ways, but this could be used to influence the decisions of other courts when deciding whether at the appellate level or at the lower court level as to what steps take that, because they actually did take the time to point out that there was no exclusion, and there is a precedent in Louisiana for coverage, okay, that where there doesn't necessarily need to be physical damage to trigger coverage for loss of income. All right, so that's important. It's distinguishable from other cases. That's what I'm trying to say here, right? So it's distinguishable. Now, I'm not a practice attorney. This is not legal advice, and I highly recommend that you reach out to your counsel, whoever is representing you at that. If you're in a lawsuit, and if they haven't noticed you of this change, right, or this recent decision, even if you're not in Louisiana, it's worth reaching out. Touch base with your counsel, touch base with your adjuster. If you're a client of GlobalPro's, we have already reached out to you. That's for sure. There is a memo being issued today to all of our clients following up on phone calls that we have made to our clients. If we haven't spoken with you, believe me, we made an attempt to contact you several times. Reach out to us. We definitely want to talk to you about your case, walk you through it. But for all those listeners out there that are not represented by GlobalPro, that have counsel or other adjusters that may file their claims, or maybe you went it alone and you received a denial, it's worth taking a closer look at your claim, looking at your policy, where you are, which state, the precedent in that state. And the third point I wanted to make, the courts did note, and this is important, that the insurer could have included a virus exclusion in the policy, but it did not. And I know I've kind of stammered around a little bit in this broadcast because I'm a bit frustrated, because I've literally said this, I don't know, 50 to 100 times over the past year or more about this issue as it relates to not only these claims, but other claims. There is a growing claims practice by insurance companies that even if your policy is silent or there's certain forms in it, that there's assumptions made in the adjustment process, and there's directives being handed down to adjusters to simply exclude or limit certain claims. And I would say that, like these claims for loss of income as it relates to the pandemic, where there's no exclusion, and the insurance company could have excluded it by including a form. And if you look at the history as it relates to virus claims and SARS and the various other types of transmittable diseases and viruses, there was lobbying efforts to approve these forms to be included, just like there was lobbying efforts to include policy forms limiting mold, asbestos, and water. And frequently we see, particularly for community associations, I will say, exclusions for water that comes from a failed plumbing system. And there's tremendous effort by the insurance companies to exclude coverage for things like that on the premise that it came from a drain. Even though it was a mechanical failure in a toilet or a heating and cooling system, it doesn't matter to them. It's that there is a directive. There is a certain precedent within the insurance company. Again, not the precedent in the states in which our insureds sit or the insureds that we represent, but a precedent within the insurance company and a directive that we don't pay these types of claims. Now, there's no real basis for it, just like I would say the majority of the claims that I have seen for damages, loss of income, as it relates to a pandemic, the majority of them should be covered, in my opinion. All right, and because so many policies, even those that may exclude certain or set certain limitations, let me say it that way, on what may be recovered, there always is room because of the ambiguous nature of these policies. Because if you look at the way that the construct of it and the way in which these policies are endorsed and these things are added, it makes it very difficult for the man on the street, a layperson, to interpret what they're actually covered for. And the commercial policy forms that we see sold to community associations and business owners alike are mostly made up of endorsements. Endorsements by way of limiting coverage, excluding coverage, and interestingly enough, even where you see it limited or excluded, sometimes they will actually add it back, but at a much more reduced amount. So there's exclusions, there's limitations, and then we see endorsements which actually add back coverage that you would have otherwise be afforded the full amount of the policy limit, which is interesting because if you actually, okay, so let's set aside the limitations and exclusions for a second and talk about the endorsements that add back coverage. I'm going to air quote this, all right? They add back coverage, but in a limited capacity. And I think one of the one standout endorsements that comes to mind is after the 2017 storm season, wind-driven rain. Suddenly, hurricane damage was something other than hurricane damage. And there was this limitation endorsed that said, if you have wind-driven rain, we're going to pay you up to $250,000. How great are we to offer this amazing new coverage to you? However, that wind-driven rain was from the hurricane. And the endorsement that now limits coverage from wind-driven rain to $250,000 would otherwise have been covered to the full amount of the limits under the policy, subject to obviously the hurricane deductible. And the endorsement for the wind-driven rain did not specifically state that the wind-driven rain was in fact from a hurricane. Now, my original understanding and interpretation of that endorsement was that if you have a standalone event, a freak storm, not a hurricane, not a windstorm, maybe even a windstorm, right? Maybe there's a windstorm, but it's not a named storm. That's There's various other different types of policy for hurricanes, named storm, windstorms, and then other windstorms. Unless windstorms defined as a named hurricane or a hurricane based on NOAA, then therefore it's not the same as a hurricane. Have I confused you or lost you yet? It's very confusing. You got to look at this closely, right? So the wind-driven rain, based on our understanding of the way the endorsements were added at that time, was to limit when you had these just thunderstorms with high wind speeds that pushed water into the building through whatever form or fashion. However, in the event of a hurricane, we had coverage for hurricanes. And the reason why I go through all of this is that if you do read some of these earlier wind-driven rain limitations, you will note that it makes no reference to a hurricane or a windstorm that is defined as a hurricane, or vice versa. A hurricane that's defined as a windstorm, because we've seen it backwards and forward. So it doesn't. It's actually silent. So it's actually interesting, because had it not been for that limitation, you would have had coverage to the full amount of limit. We're seeing this with overflows and backups and sewer drains. At one point it stated that if it was an off-site drain backup or failure that led to damages on site, then you were excluded or limited for that. But if it occurred on site, you had full amount of your limits. They've now modified those forms to exclude on site. And now anytime water comes from a drain, it's suddenly not covered, and which is totally on its face wrong. The reality of it is again, there's typically, most often what we find through investigation with experts, engineers, plumbers, building consultants, is that there's usually some mechanical failure that leads to the failure. But we've seen insurance companies try to fit that round peg into a square hole. So the reason why I bring all of this up is that here, and the third point that I made was that the courts did note that the insurance companies had access to forms that could have excluded this, and they did not include them, right? So let's just summarize this again. Number one, the policy did not contain an exclusion for a virus, all right? Number one, the policy did not contain an exclusion for virus. Number two, there is a precedent in Louisiana that physical damage was not necessary to trigger coverage. And number three, the courts did note that the insurer could have included a virus exclusion in the policy, and they did not. All right. So again, check with your insurance coverage experts, check with your representatives, whether they be attorney or a public adjuster, to see if you may fit into this type of situation. This may apply to you, and it may be something that may change the direction and the decisions of other courts. So again, though, however, not all states have the same precedent as Louisiana, so it's a really important issue, and it's really important to note that. I'm not saying that this is a one-size-fits-all, but this is definitely a very positive outcome for policyholders and a long-awaited decision, because I really think that they got it right here, and I definitely think that you're going to see things change in Louisiana, and I would expect things potentially to change in other states thereafter. So check your policies, see if you have that exclusion in there, start questioning whether or not there's a precedent within your state. And always remember, they always had an opportunity to exclude this. So, and if they didn't, I think I explained myself at this point. So, switching gears real quick to storm season. Now, storm season comes in many forms and fashions, right? And we have seen a supercell that absolutely damaged a tremendous area throughout the Midwest just recently. Our folks in the Midwest, the clients that we represent, many in the hospitality and the community association industry, definitely dealt with a big one there. We're obviously seeing areas of interest pop up throughout the tropics, so make sure that you continue to monitor the situation. And one thing I can say about the Midwest is I'm seeing a lot of the same practices by policyholders actually that led to a lot of the litigation, denials, and underpayments of claims in Texas following the big freeze. Be careful by stepping into the shoes of a plumber or a roofing contractor or an engineer. You're not an expert if you're a business owner, community association manager. This is not your expertise. The way in which you represent your damages is important. You have an obligation to prove your damages. However, you lack the experience and knowledge to both navigate the policy limitations and exclusions, which by now, if you're listening to this, you realize how complicated all of this can be. It's important that you also, then the second part of that would be that you have to actually be able to identify all of those damage and put together a scope, and most policies require itemization. Also require you to do both evaluations and replacement costs as well as actual cash value to assess the reasonable deductible that is most often listed on your deck page or in an endorsement. So, but again, learn from the mistakes of others. And best practice would be to contact insurance coverage experts that can help you navigate this process. We're very active in the Midwest representing policyholders that have suffered damages, not only from this recent storm, but others. We're investigating dozens others right now. We're still going out to property. It's not too late. If you've reported your claim, the adjuster's been out there, you've met with contractors, it's still not too late to steer you towards recovery. And that's what we want to do. We want to help you recover. That's what we're all about here at GlobalPro. We've been doing it for the last 10 years. We have managed more than $1 billion, and we're going to continue to advocate for the policyholder. Now, if you've liked this broadcast and you like what you're hearing and seeing, make sure you hit that subscribe button, like us and follow us on all the social media. We want to continue to provide you information you can use. So continue to tune in every single week right here, 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I'm Dan Odess with GlobalPro on the Recovery Report Live.